I think we will get started. I want to thank all of you for coming out in this kind of weather to be with us. This is our third cause lecture for the 2017-2018 academic year. And so I'm very pleased that you're here. Also, I want you to mark your calendar. We have our postdoctoral fellow, Waverly Duck, who will be our next speaker on April the 6th of this year. There is another addition to our staff. Diane Glave is teaching a course on African American history for us, and I'd just like to have her raise her hand. We need all the troops we can get to teach these courses on African American history. This is a special day. I'm especially pleased to introduce Andrew Masich. I've known Andrew for a long time and consider Andrew a friend and a colleague. But before I get started, Andrew, I want to say a few words that people who come to this event know that they're going to be in for a litany of people who support the cause series. And that means the president's office, the provost, the dean, and our department chair, now Donna Harsh. I know she's here, but I can't see her. Okay. Also, the Giant Eagle Foundation support us. BNY Mellon, the Falk Fund when it was in existence, and Highmark Charitable supports this effort. And we're getting ongoing support from Milton and Nancy Washington, although Milton passed away recently. So I want to thank everyone who plays a role in our work, including Nico Slate and a number of people on our advisory board. So thank you all. It would be a mistake to overlook the staff support too. Natalie Taylor, our business manager, Hikaria Day, and Jesse, where are you? Jesse Wilson, our photographer. So we are appreciative of all the work that you do and the support that you give us. But let us turn to Andrew. Andrew has a hefty resume. It was a challenge just reading all of the accomplishments. But what I tried to do was to consider what is fundamental about Andrew in the context of all these multiple dimensions of his contributions. Most important, Andrew is the president and chief executive officer of the Senator John Heinz History Center. Okay, it is a Smithsonian affiliate, and it is Pennsylvania's largest history museum. Under Andrew's leadership, the Heinz History Center has emerged as the leading affiliate of the Smithsonian Institution, which is based in Washington, D.C., as you know, and it has accreditation by the prestigious American Alliance of Museums. Dr. Masich is also a past chairman of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. This commission is responsible for promoting and preserving the historical experience across the state. So Andrew has had his hands full. In short, Andrew is one of the most accomplished and influential museum professionals and public historians in America today. He received his BA and MA degrees from the University of Arizona at Tucson, where he earned a double major in history and anthropology/archaeology. He also earned a graduate degree in history and museum administration. Before arriving in Pittsburgh in 1998, he served as director of museums at Yuma and Tucson for the Arizona State Historical Society. He was also a vice president of the Colorado Historical Association. When he arrived in Pittsburgh just 2 years before the new millennium, he hit the ground running. And he continues to run. It's amazing. Okay. He helped to transform the Hines History Center into one of the foremost public history institutions in the nation. But at the same time, he produced a substantial body of scholarship that deepened our knowledge of U.S. history during the 19th and 20th century. His published books include Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, a ledger book of coups and combat, University Press of Colorado, 1997, and a Choice Academic Book of the Year. Half-Breed, the remarkable true story of George Bent, caught between the worlds of the Indian and the white man, published in 2004, and winner of the Colorado Book Award. The Civil War in Arizona, the story of the California Volunteers, 1861 to 1865, published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2006, and named Southwest Book of the Year. And Dan Rooney, moving into the 20th century, my 75 years with the Pittsburgh Steelers and the NFL, a collaboration with his colleague David Hallis and Dan Rooney himself, a New York Times bestseller, 2007. So Andrew has been busy writing as well as administering one of the foremost institutions of the state and the nation. But I want to say this about Andrew, because we got to know Andrew on the ground at Carnegie Mellon a few years ago. And without missing a step in his work as president and CEO, in 2014, Andrew completed a PhD degree in history from Carnegie Mellon University. He wrote an extraordinary dissertation titled Civil Wars in the Southwest Borderlands, Cultures in Conflict, 1861 to 1867. Last year, just 3 years beyond the dissertation, the University of Oklahoma published his new book titled Civil War in the Southwest Borderlands, 1861 to 67. A revised version of the PhD dissertation. So today, we're in for a treat. Based upon his extraordinary body of work, Andrew will deliver the cause lecture titled Civil War in the Borderlands, Reflections on African Americans in War in the Southwest. So let us please welcome Andrew Masich.
Joe has been a mentor to me and a great friend in the years that I've been here in Pittsburgh, and that's one of the high honors of my life, is being introduced by Joe Trotter. So thank you, Joe. When Joe asked me to do this lecture, I had to remind him, remember, Joe, I'm not an expert in African American history. My field is Southwest Borderlands. I look at the convergence of cultures along the border with Mexico, mostly in the 19th century. And he said, I understand that, but in your travels through history, I'm sure you've run across African American stories and the African American experience, even though it wasn't the focus of your work. And I thought about it, and he was really right. And as I prepared for tonight, I was surprised myself at how many times I came across African American stories intersecting with Anglo-American stories and Indian stories and Hispano stories in the Southwest. And it reminded me of how interconnected we all are. One of the things I want to just remind us is that we are all Africans. It's just a question of when we left. Anatomically modern humans left Africa 60 to 70,000 years ago. No human beings originated on this continent. They all came from Africa and then spread out over time. The the first peoples to come here. You want to see that slide again? Isn't that a good slide? The first peoples who came here came during the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago. And then with global warming 20,000 years ago, the water levels rose, the ice sheets melted, and this continent was again cut off from Siberia and Asia. So the first peoples who came here, we today call American Indians. And they're the descendants of those Ice Age hunters who came here. By the 1500s, Europeans had found their way to the Americas, and the Spanish first, in search of gold and in search of souls to save, found their way into the Southwest, what we call the Southwest Borderlands today. But this is what the Spanish thought of the New World here. This, by the way, is California. See that big island? This is how much they knew about the territory that they had invaded and were now exploring. They said after they actually got here and sailed ships up this gulf that California no es isla sino peninsula. It's not an island, it's a peninsula. And so that changed how they would explore the Southwest. But one of the first people to get there, before Coronado and all of those conquistadors who found their way to the what we call the Southwest Borderlands today, was an African named Esteban. Estebanico, the Spanish called him. And he was lost. He came to Florida with the Narvaez expedition and with a man named Cabeza de Vaca. He wandered through Texas, through Arizona, New Mexico, trying to find people like them, Spanish-speaking people. And he was finally found by a priest, Fray Marcos de Niza, who said, "Where have you guys been, and what kind of people did you meet?" They were dying to know what kind of people Esteban and the rest of his party with Cabeza de Vaca had met. And they revealed that they had met hundreds, thousands of Native American people in villages that were built of stone and well established. They even said they have gold in those cities. And in fact, the cities are as large as the city of Mexico, the big Aztec city in central Mexico. And so Coronado, the conquistador in the gold armor there, he led an expedition to the north in search of the 7 golden cities of Cibola, these fabled cities of gold that Esteban and Cabeza de Vaca and Fray Marcos de Niza had told them about. Well, the Spanish invaded. They found the cities of Pueblo Indians at Zuni, and they reduced them, they destroyed them, they captured the people, they took them, they enslaved those people. And they found no gold to speak of. Bartolome de las Casas was a Dominican friar who saw what was going on, and he said, "Wait a second, this isn't right." He said, "You're enslaving all those people. They have souls just like anybody else. What gives us the right to enslave them?" And the king of Spain said, "Well, they are part of encomiendas. They're part of the land that I have granted to these conquistadors. They not only get the land, but they get the people on the land. And they get to enslave those people and use them to mine gold and develop plantations. They're part of the package." And De las Casas said, "That's not right." And he wrote a book about the destruction of the people of the Indies. And he started what historians now call La Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend, which is the legend that the Spanish were cruel taskmasters. And there's a lot of truth to it. But the Spanish developed the new Americas. But they used up the Indian people so quickly, millions of them died from disease and overwork, that even De las Casas said, boy, you need to import some people from Africa if you're going to make a go of this conquest of the Americas. And De las Casas later regretted that he said this. He retracted the statement because the Spanish agreed with it and said, yeah, we've used up millions of native peoples already, and we need more labor. So let's go to Africa. And that's what they did. These lines show how many Africans, about 12 million Africans were stolen from that continent between 1500 and 1867. And here we see the paths that they took. About 400,000 of them ended up in North America, or what is now the United States. Most of them ended up in Brazil and in the Caribbean here. Some of them in the Yucatan and Mexico itself. So this is when Africans come in large numbers to the Americas. Now, the Spanish were okay with mixing of races. And they used that term, raza, or more often casta. They would refer to casta, meaning race. And they even did charts. Now, Paul Ice and I have talked about this. I'm not sure that we agree on how, what these charts mean, but this was a popular form of painting in the 18th century in Mexico. And what we see are the different degrees of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. And they would say if you have an Espanol and an India, a woman Indian, you would have a mestizo. And if you have a Espanol con mora, a Spanish man, and a Moorish or African woman, you have a mulatto. And a mulatto con española is a morisco. And so they had all these names for all these people who were part white, part black, part Indian. And it was a stratified kind of society. The whiter you were, the more influence you had. The darker you were, the less. Over time, that became less and less important in Mexico. This process of mestizaje, the mixing of races, was so prevalent that everybody was mixed race. There was still a kind of caste, but it was very fluid. It's different than how it evolved in Anglo-America. Now, by 1803, Americans from the United States were moving west. They went into French and Spanish territory. 1803, what big expedition that we know about that started here in Pittsburgh? Lewis and Clark, of course, started right down here near the convention center where their boat was built. Then the 55-foot long keel boat went down the Ohio, up the Mississippi, up the Missouri River. With them was an African-American man named York. And now York was, York was a slave of William Clark. He had been given to him by Clark's father when William was just a boy. They grew up together. And York went with Lewis and Clark on the expedition, along with 25 other men. They went 8,000 miles. It took them nearly 4 years. They crossed the whole continent. They met many Indian peoples and mapped the Tierra Incognita, the unknown land, for the first time by Euro-Americans. Now, people that met York, these Indian people, they were amazed by him. They had never seen a black man before. In fact, before Lewis and Clark's boat would pull up, the Indian peoples had already heard that a black man was coming. They said, no, that's impossible. I want to see this. And so they would rush out and meet York. The Arikaras and the Shoshone people and the Mandans all wanted a piece of York. Literally, the Indian men at this time would sometimes share their wives with bold warriors or people that they respected, hoping to gain some of their power. And through sexual contact, this was a fairly common thing. Well, York slept with a lot of Indian women during this time, and Clark noted in his diary that all the Indians think that York is big medicine. Big medicine is the word that he used. Now, shortly after Lewis and Clark went west, a guy named Jim Beckwourth headed west. His mother was, he said, a mulatta, and his father was a white plantation owner in Georgia who taught Beckwourth how to read and taught him blacksmithing and raised him as his son. And Beckwourth joined free trappers who were exploring the West, trapping beaver. Beaver hats, beaver pelts were in great demand in Europe and in the United States. And so Beckwourth went west. He's largely known today because he wrote a book. He wrote an autobiography, The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth, chief of the Crow Nation of Indians. And in fact, he did marry 3 Crow women serially. And although it was common for men to marry sororate marriage, marriage of sisters would have been common for Indian men, and so it would have been common or accepted practice for Jim Beckwourth as well. And he became widely known as a trapper and scout for the Army. He operated out of Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River in southern Colorado. And he started the town of Pueblo, Colorado. You've probably heard of Pueblo today. That's a Jim Beckwourth trading post. Now, at the same time that's going on, the Civil War begins. The ripples of war go west. Now, there's already tension in the West. As Indian peoples are fighting Hispanic peoples, Anglos are thrust into the mix after the war with Mexico in 1848. And so there are these conflicts that are going on when the Civil War changes everything. The rules of warfare change when the Civil War begins. Because, well, think of it like this. Before a tidal wave hits, have you heard about what happens on the shoreline? The sea recedes, and you can see fish flopping around, and you can see parts of the ocean floor that have never been exposed before. And people go rushing out to pick up fish and to explore, and then this wall of water comes back in and crushes them and rushes far inland, farther than it's ever been before. That's what the Civil War was like in the Southwest borderlands. Because when the war began, the federal presence vanished. The federal troops, the regular soldiers, were withdrawn. They closed the forts, they burned the supplies, and they bugged out. They were going to fight at the seat of the rebellion in the east. Well, Indian peoples, especially Navajos and Apaches and Comanches were the most numerous, they saw this as an opportunity. And they wanted to pick up those fish that were available now. And they attacked the remaining forts and villages and mining camps that were now exposed. And so the avalanche that followed was this invasion of federal troops that came by 1862 and 63. more troops than had ever been in the Southwest before. The state of California raised 16,000 soldiers, which is more than the entire regular army of the whole country when the Civil War began. And this avalanche of military might rushed over the Indian peoples. The Navajos were crushed. These are Navajo people, 8,000 of them, in an internment camp in New Mexico on the Pecos River, the Bosque Redondo Reservation. And those are California volunteer soldiers guarding them. James H. Carleton, the guy on the left here, was the commander of all the troops in the West. And he enlisted Kit Carson, one of the famous mountain men, a good friend of Jim Beckwith, to raise troops from New Mexico and California to crush the raiding tribes. And they started with the Navajos, and they went into their canyonland haunts. They destroyed their sheep, they burned their peach trees and their crops, and they made it impossible for those people to live in their native homes. And they relocated them on reservations where they taught them to be farmers, and they gave them books, and they taught them Christianity. They did the same with the Apaches, starting with the Mescalero Apaches. They put them on the same reservation with the Navajos, whom they had been fighting for 200 years. But Carleton figured, you know, they're all Apachean. They all speak sort of the same language, so we'll put them all on the same reservation. Well, that started all kinds of conflict, and one group would bolt from the reservation. The army would use the warriors from the other tribe to chase after them and bring them back. And then the Mescaleros would bolt, and the Navajos would chase after them and bring them back. And while this was going on, the Comanches on the plains of Texas were attacking the herds of the interned Indians who were at Bosque Redondo. So there's a swirl of civil wars and conflicts going on during the Civil War. It's confusing which side you're on. This man, Merihildo Grijalva, was an Opata Indian living in Sonora, Mexico, when he was captured by Apaches, Chiricahua Apaches, at the age of 8. Grijalva went and lived with the Apaches, knew all about them, could speak their language, and when he was a young man, he escaped and went to a Mexican settlement where he learned Spanish and was raised as a New Mexican. Then when the Anglos came in during the Civil War, they needed somebody who could guide them to the enemy Apache haunts. And Merihildo Grijalva was the perfect man because he knew where they camped, he knew where they hunted, he knew where the good water holes were, and he led the troops right to them. The New Mexico volunteers, the California volunteers, and their Indian allies among the Pimas and the Hopis and the Zunis attacked the Apaches. So everybody is fighting everybody else, and everybody is enslaving everybody else. The Navajos would raid the New Mexico settlements and steal boys, sometimes women, but mostly boys, who they needed to replace their losses and to be herders. They had large herds of sheep and goats and cattle and horses. They needed those boys. So they would raid the New Mexico settlements. The New Mexicans then would raid the Navajo and Apache camps and steal women and children. They would kill the men, but they would steal women and children, bring them back, and enslave them. Now, they called it peonage, debt peonage, which means, well, the debt that you're paying off is that you're the wrong race, pretty much. And you are enslaved, but sometimes incorporated into the family. You're baptized. That's the difference. You're baptized when you come into a Hispano family. And that makes it a little bit different. Now, this is a white girl. She was a Mormon girl who was traveling across Arizona in 1851 when her wagon train was attacked by Yavapai Indians. They're closely related to Apaches. And their whole family was killed except for Olive and her little sister Mary Ann. Their brother Lorenzo was clubbed and left for dead. He actually survived and was nursed back to health by Pima Indians, who were the arch enemies of the Apaches and the Yavapais. And Olive was enslaved by the Yavapais for several years. She had to tote their water and chop the wood and do all the hard work in the camp. But then the Mojave Indians on the Colorado River bought her from the Yavapais, and she lived with them. And that's when she got those tattoos, those famous tattoos on her face. And after 7 years of captivity, Olive Oatman was redeemed. Those are the words that they used then, redeemed. She was brought back to her people. And she married afterwards, and she filed a claim against the United States government. This is Olive Oatman's affidavit and her claim. You can see it's tied up in red tape. That's how all government documents were bundled in those days. Red twill tape was used to bundle them, and then they'd shove them into pigeonholes. If you were in a hurry, you'd take a knife and cut through the red tape and get right to the document. That term was in common use by the time of the Civil War, cutting through the red tape. But Debbie and I went to, oh, that's Debbie over there. Debbie, would you wave? Debbie is my wife of, this is our 40th wedding anniversary year. And, but she is also the best research assistant ever born. And Debbie and I go to the National Archives where we find these documents, and it's in those documents that the detailed stories of the people of the Southwest Borderlands can be found. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here because Joe took so long introducing me. I'm going to have to really... George Bent, half Cheyenne, half white, marries the daughter of the arrow keeper of the Cheyennes, the holiest man in the Cheyenne tribe. Magpie Woman becomes his wife. And George Bent and his family run Bent's Fort, that big adobe castle that Jim Beckwith worked out of. And when William Bent, George's father, came to the fort, he brought with him a black servant, a slave. His name was Tom Green, and when the Cheyenne saw him, they said, "Whoa, look at that guy. Not only is he black, but he can drive a wagon standing up." The Indians just could never get the hang of driving wagons. They were great horsemen, but the idea of driving a wagon, and Green would stand up with his reins and would drive the wagon. And they called him the Black White Man. The Black White Man. They called him a Black White Man because he had all the characteristics of a white man. He had a hat. White men always wear hats. He had heels on his shoes. White men always have heels on their shoes. You see, an Indian man would never have heels on his moccasins. And that's why white men walk kind of like ducks. They plant their heel first. And if you're tracking one, I don't know how many white men you've had a chance to track, but their toes go out, because they put their heels down first. Indians walk with their toes pointed in because they walk on the balls of their feet. So when you walk on the balls of your feet, your toes point straight ahead or even slightly pigeon-toed. So these black white men had all the characteristics of white men, but they happened to be black. And the Indian people would draw pictures. Indian men. Women only did abstract art on parfleches and lodges and utilitarian tools. Only men did representational art showing a human being or an animal. So it was the men who did these drawings. And when white men came with paper, the Indians thought, wow, this is something, because we can now draw in a book what we used to draw on a lodge skin, a buffalo hide lodge skin, but a buffalo hide lodge skin weighs 200 pounds, and you can't just wrap it up and take it with you. But with a book, you can draw in it, and you can tuck it in your waistband and jump on your horse, and you're gone. And there was a kind of language that they developed, an orthography. So here's a white man. He's wearing a hat. These are steps. These are bullets flying through the air. Here's talking. See the thunder or lightning coming out of the mouth. Here's a mule with notched ears. Here's a frightened white man or black man with big round eyes. Indian men would never draw their own eyes. Only frightened enemies have eyes. Here's a buffalo wallow, a bugle, a horse has been by. So any Plains Indian man could look at one of those drawings and know what it meant. And so here's a typical one. And I had the opportunity to work with Cheyenne and Arapaho elders to interpret this book that was captured in battle in 1869 at Summit Springs, Colorado, from Cheyenne dog soldiers. The dog soldiers were one of 6 warrior societies among the Cheyenne people, the dog men. There were elkhorn scrapers, and there were kit foxes, and there were bowstrings. But the dog soldiers were some of the fiercest of the warrior societies. And here, this warrior has drawn a picture of himself. He says, I was riding my horse, here are the tracks, when I was knocked off. I fired 2 shots with my revolver. And then I either dismounted, we're not sure, or fell off his horse to reload. Here's his powder horn. Here's his gun. Here's his name. This is Red Lance. See, he's drawing his name right over his head. And he said, the soldiers were all shooting at me. See their bullets here? See his 2 bullets here? He's being very specific. This is exactly what happened to me that day. And then one white man came riding out, aimed his gun right at me, pulled the trigger, and poof. See that flash in the pan right there? There's a poof right there that shows that the gun has misfired. Nothing's coming out here. And that's why that warrior drew that picture. He's saying, my holy preparations worked for me that day. I painted myself yellow, the color of the sun. I put buffalo tracks up my right leg. I wore my blanket around my waist. I let my hair loose that day instead of braided as I normally would. And I put the moon on my chest. And that protected me from that soldier. So that's why he did that drawing. And so we have hundreds of these drawings. And if you know the vocabulary, if you know how to read them, there are wonderful stories in there. And there are stories of black white men too in those ledger books. This is the Moffat ledger that I found at the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives. And here's a Cheyenne warrior. You can see he's wearing his hair braided with red Stroud cloth in his braids. And these 2 buffalo soldiers have grabbed him with their carbines at the ready. Here's the warrior's horse here. You can see his footsteps here. He's being very specific. Unfortunately, we don't know who that is, and we don't know what that incident was, but it was probably done in 1874. I'm not going to go into all of these. We can talk later, but I wanted you to see this is a buffalo wallow with a bunch of men hiding out in there. Red Lance again is counting coup on them with his bow. He's got his bow and he's touching them with it, and he's saying, I touched you, and I could have killed you if I wanted to, but I'm going to give you your life. He's counting coup. He's showing his power over his enemies. But one of the men in that buffalo wallow is dark-skinned. All the rest are white. One is dark-skinned. And as we were studying these, we found other events that might be the same event, a fight of men in a buffalo wallow. This is how a Harper's Weekly artist might depict that same fight. And the one that we found from 1865 show the warriors corralled these men in a buffalo wallow. One of them was black. He rose up, the black man rose up with his carbine to get a better shot. He fired, and just as he fired, one of the warriors shot him and hit him in the head, knocked him backwards into the buffalo wallow. The ball glanced off his skull. He wasn't dead, but he was knocked out. The other men in the buffalo wallow shoved his body up on the rim of the wallow as a breastwork, and they kept fighting, while the black man moaned. That was how the Indians described that fight. Now, while this is all going on back east, there are thousands of people who had been enslaved who now find themselves without a master, and they flock to the Union armies who are invading the South. And this picture is entitled Contraband, Recruit, Veteran. So it's the same man. This is how he looks when he joins the Union Army. 180,000 African American men joined the United States Army to help put down the rebellion, restore the Union, and win their freedom. And here, unfortunately, this man is missing a leg. He's wearing his tattered greatcoat here. But this is what these men looked like. Here's the 23rd USCT, U.S. Colored Troops. And of course, they've got a white officer here. This is early in the war. This is 1863. There have been no commissioned African Americans yet. And this is what these men might have looked like in the field, firing their rifle muskets. At the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg in 1864, the 23rd USCT, the U.S. Colored Troops, suffered the highest casualties of any African American regiment of the entire war, certainly the highest at this battle, which, if you remember your history, the Union troops dug a trench underneath a tunnel underneath the Confederate lines, packed it with explosives, blew it up, creating a crater. The U.S. Colored Troops rushed into the breach along with some white regiments following, and it was a bloodbath because the Confederates were able to rally quickly enough, and it was like shooting fish in a barrel. It turned into a Union defeat when it should have been a great victory. But those 23rd USCT men were there, and they stood their ground, and they died by the hundreds. Those same troops were then sent west in 1865. The war had ended. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and those troops, those colored troops, were rushed to the border of Mexico. The French had invaded Mexico during the Civil War. Seeing the opening, knowing that the Americans couldn't do anything about it to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, the French took advantage and tried to reestablish empire in the Americas. And they took advantage of the Mexicans fighting themselves. The Mexicans were fighting their own civil war, liberals against conservatives. The liberals under Benito Juarez, the Republicans, were supported by Abraham Lincoln's government, but they couldn't be overt about it. It was like the Iran-Contra affair. The Americans were shipping guns and uniforms and supplies across the Rio Grande to the Mexicans under Juarez, but they couldn't tell the French that. They couldn't let it be known that they were supporting them because Abraham Lincoln and the Union men were worried that England and France could come in on the side of the South and tip the balance of power in the Americas. But now the war is over, and the Americans feel strong enough that they can rush troops, 50,000 troops to the border, including many black troops, and the 23rd USCT were some of the most experienced veterans. But some of those veterans deserted. They went across the border to Mexico. They were induced by the conservatives. General Tomas Mejia said, "We'll pay you 5 times what the Americans pay you, and you'll have opportunity. And there isn't the kind of racism here that you're experiencing north of the border." So some of those troops went. James Smith and George Elrath and James Green were 3 of those men who went across the border and were captured, and Tomas Mejia, or the Mexicans, wrote to the American officers on the other side of the border and said, "We have 3 of your 23rd U.S. colored troops here, and they were fighting against us. what would you like us to do with them before we hang them? And General George Weitzel wrote back to Mejia and said, look, if you found them in arms against you, I have nothing more to say. But I'd like you to, before you try them, he was trying to say, hey, they deserve a trial, not just summary execution. I want you to consider the situation. They were induced by large sums of money. Consider their ignorance of your language and try to do the right thing. So there were a lot of black men in the Army who saw an opportunity in the West, either to go across the border into Mexico or to start a new life in the West. One of those men was George Goldsby. And unfortunately, that's not really a picture of George Goldsby. There isn't one of him, but he's one of the most fascinating people you'll ever run across. I met him through Jim Leiker, who was giving a paper in San Diego where I was giving a paper, and he introduced me to the Goldsby story. Goldsby's from Alabama. He's born into slavery. He comes north with Robert E. Lee's army during the Gettysburg campaign. He's a servant to Confederate officers. He deserts at Gettysburg, goes to Harrisburg, and joins the 21st Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. That's a white cavalry regiment. This guy is, he said, a quadroon. He's a quarter black. His father was white, a white plantation owner. His mother was a mulatta. And now this guy is listed on the muster roll of the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry as dark complexioned. But they took him in. He served the war in this white regiment. But in 1866, as the war is over and there's a westward movement, the federal government says those black soldiers were pretty good. We ought to keep some regiments of them, and they established 4 regular regiments, not volunteer regiments, but regular Army professional soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the 23rd and 24th Infantry regiments, and a regiment's about 1,000 men each. And George Goldsby joins the 10th Cavalry, the 10th Black Cavalry, and he's listed on the muster roll as light complexioned. And he goes to Oklahoma, he meets an Indian woman, Ellen Beck, marries her, has 4 children. One of them is Cherokee Bill, a notorious outlaw in the days of the Wild West. But Goldsby is quite a guy. He doesn't back down to anyone. And one of the most famous incidents in the West happened near Fort Concho, Texas, at a town called San Angelo, where Goldsby was quartered. He's now a first sergeant. First sergeant's the guy who runs the company or the troop. He's the top non-commissioned officer. And one of Goldsby's men had gone to town to a bar, a saloon called Morris's Tavern, and there he started dancing with Hispanas, Mexican-American women. Some Texas Rangers came into the bar, saw a black man dancing with those Hispanas, and they pistol whipped him and ran him out of the place. He went back to the fort. The soldiers, the black troops, came back into town, and they mixed it up with those Texas Rangers. Shortly thereafter, Goldsby himself was in town, and those same Texas Rangers attempted to humiliate him. They cut the chevrons off of his sleeves, they sliced the stripes off of his trousers, and sent him back to the fort. Well, Goldsby wasn't going to stand for that. He has the key to the arms locker. He rallies his guys. They all grab a carbine. They come back to Morris's Tavern, and Frederick Remington painted this image. Frederick Remington, the painter, embedded himself with the 10th U.S. Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, and heard the story from men what was thar. Men, what was thar, is what he said. They said. All of them said, well, I wasn't thar, but I heard about it. That's what Remington said. But he talked to a sergeant who wouldn't name himself, who got the skinny on this shootout. These black soldiers walked into the bar with their carbines, walked right up to the bar, and ordered a drink. And then Goldsby says, "About face, fire!" And they opened fire. They killed 3 of the Texas Rangers, wounded another one of them. One of the Buffalo soldiers was killed. There was so much smoke in that bar that nobody could see anything. There was gunfire going on for minutes, it seemed like, until the men of the 10th got on the floor, crawled out the back, and there holding the door on the back door was Sergeant Goldsby. And those men made their escape. Well, the Texas Rangers went to Fort Concho to see Benjamin Grierson, the guy who was in charge. Benjamin Grierson was born in Allegheny City here in Pittsburgh. He was a music teacher before the war. Got kicked by a horse when he was 8 and was deathly afraid of horses, but he became one of the best cavalry commanders in the Union Army. There was a movie made about him called The Horse Soldiers, starring John Wayne years ago. Check it out sometime. So Grierson meets the assault of the Texas Rangers, and he says, "I'm sorry, you have no jurisdiction on this post. You can't have those men." And he actually got the Texas Ranger captain fired from his job, went to the governor. But those men were brought up on charges, and Goldsby had to desert. He took some extra arms and an extra horse, and he bolted for Mexico and wasn't heard from again for many, many years. Well, the same time that's going on, 1877, the first African American graduates from West Point. There had been men before him, before Henry Ossian Flipper, Henry Flipper, this fellow right here, but the endemic racism that was part of the United States Army, that was part of the United States culture, drove him out, drove those earlier West Point cadets out of the military academy. But Flipper stuck with it. He stuck with it. It was amazing. And he graduated in the middle of his class. And they sent him west with the 10th Cavalry. He knew Goldsby. He served in the same regiment with him at Fort Concho. But there were white officers who couldn't stand the idea of a black man in uniform. A black man as an officer. And they got him on trumped-up charges for stealing funds from the quartermaster, and he was cashiered from the service after 4 years. This man here, at the same time that's going on, won the Medal of Honor in Arizona in action against Mescalero Apache Indians. He braved the bullets of the enemy, ran out in the open, and rescued another trooper, put him on his back, carried him to safety. John Denny was a Medal of Honor winner. Well, we've been talking about Buffalo soldiers, and this is another Remington drawing showing what a Buffalo soldier might have looked like in the field. That's his field uniform with the 1883 hat and the campaign shirt and his gun belt and high-top boots. You can see he's got his spurs kind of just hooked on to his boots here because he's walking around. And he's talking sign language to this Indian. Most Indians on the plains could speak, even if they came from different linguistic traditions, could speak sign language. It was a universal language, a lingua franca of the plains. And so here's a Buffalo soldier talking to an Indian. And people ask, where did that name Buffalo soldiers come from? And some have said, well, the Army issued buffalo overcoats and with muskrat hats on, well, they would look like buffaloes. That's probably apocryphal. Those coats weren't issued till much later. But the Indian people did know buffaloes. And when they saw buffaloes with that tuft of hair between their horns, an Army wife, Frances Rowe, in 1871, wrote a letter from Camp Supply, Oklahoma, and said, The white officers say those black soldiers fight like fiends, and the Indians call them buffalo soldiers. That's the first documented use of that term, buffalo soldiers, in 1871. And then Grierson, Benjamin Grierson, the guy at Fort Concho who protected his soldiers from the Texas Rangers, he used the term in 1871 as well. Now, what Indians would call them when they would see them, they would use the same sign language that they'd use for white men. The men who wear hats all in a row. All in a row. The ones who wear hats all in a row. That's how they saw soldiers. Those guys who are always marching together all in a row. And so they would use that same symbol for black soldiers, but then they might touch something black and then go like this. So white men all in a row, black. And that's what those buffalo soldiers looked like in the field. And that's what Frederick Remington saw when he rode with them. And this is a great photograph of a buffalo soldier and a Remington version. And I just like the way they kind of work together. Now, some people know about buffalo soldiers from television today. And Larry McMurtry told the story in Lonesome Dove of a man named Joshua Dietz. And Joshua Dietz was played by Danny Glover. And there's the real Joshua Dietz. His name was Bose Ickard. He worked for the Charles Goodnight brand. And these were the Texas cattlemen who drove thousands of cattle from Texas to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where all those Navajos were interned because the army needed to feed those Navajo people that they had captured. And then any cattle that were left, they would drive north to the Colorado gold fields, to Denver. So Bose Ickard is a real guy. And people talk about cowboys, black cowboys in the West. And in my research, I haven't come across that many black cowboys. In the depredation claims, those claims tied up in red tape where we found Olive Oatman, we do find some. Some people say as many as 1 in 4 cowboys were black in the West. It's possible, and they might have looked like this, but these cowboys, Nat Love and Bill Pickett, were really kind of show cowboys. But we don't have pictures of those other guys. Bill Pickett is the guy credited with bulldogging. He invented bulldogging. You've seen at a rodeo when a rider will come riding out, he'll leap off his horse, grab a cow by the horns, a steer, thank you, a steer by the, he's not milking it, he's bulldogging it. And he turns that steer's head and tackles him, essentially, holds him down, then ties his legs up. Well, here's the guy who invented that rodeo sport, Bill Pickett.
Didn't he get kicked in the head or something?
He did get kicked in the head when he, yeah, that's right. And then Nat Love was another cowboy, and he wrote an autobiography, and that's why we know so much about him. A lot of his stories are apocryphal. He met everyone from Billy the Kid to Sacagawea. But that's what people know about black cowboys or African Americans in the West today. Well, I've just touched on some of the characters that I've met in my historical wanderings. And some of those stories are in my book, Civil War in the Southwest, Borderlands. But don't be disappointed if it's all those stories aren't in there. I think that might be my next book, because it's a terrific story. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Do we have time for questions?
We do. We will open it for questions. Okay.
Any questions? Maybe I would put a more interesting slide up. Yeah. Yes, Sam.
Not necessarily, I guess, a question, but just a comment. And it's not, it's related to cowboys, not in that particular area of the country. You may want to look at the Spanish settlements in Florida, around St. Augustine, where there is documentation of Africans working in cattle ranches. And some historians point to that period as the introduction of people of African descent doing cowboy work.
Right. I know there's been a lot of debate over even the term cowboy. Where does it come from, and is it from the southeast? Yes.
Yeah, you talked about how federal U.S. federal troops before the Civil War had forts and different activities in the Southwest, and they left at the beginning of the war. I'm assuming to go back and kind of connect with their regiments or their but there was a real mix of northern and southerners in the military. In fact, Lee, tell me the other side, but Lincoln almost chose Lee as the leader of the U.S. troops. I was learning that the other day.
Well, he was the top United States soldier. He had been in command of West Point. He couldn't break away from his state of Virginia.
I only mention as a tidbit for this, but so when the Civil War began in earnest, the federal troops come back, you say, and sort of, they were the flood.
The avalanche or the tidal wave that swept over.
My understanding is there was contention prior to the Civil War, and then even during the early period, and even later, of the tension between Northerners and Southerners trying to lay claim to these territories that weren't states yet, or they weren't established.
Well, remember, when the Civil War begins, a Confederate Army of New Mexico marches from Texas up the Rio Grande and marches all the way almost to Colorado, capturing Union forts along the way. And it takes the Union Army time to raise Colorado volunteers, New Mexico volunteers, and California volunteers, because the regular soldiers have all left. So this new flood of soldiers is actually homegrown in the West. They're not Easterners who are coming out with the tidal wave. It's a tidal wave coming from the West. And they sweep over, and the Confederates are stopped dead in their tracks just northeast of Santa Fe in March of 1862. And they're pitched battles. I mean, they're frontal assaults. There are guys with lances doing charges. The only time in the Civil War that lances were used in battle. This isn't just sniping in the desert. These are pitched battles in New Mexico.
The other thing that's striking, the generalization I make, is that African people that freed themselves and that joined the military really couldn't depend on their white Union officers any more than they could have on their white owners in the South when it came down to. I mean, you made a point that one person over the
Grierson
protected him temporarily, but the guy ends up being run out anyway. In other words, the black hero of the story ends up being treated no differently.
For a white officer in the post-war army, a white officer in a black regiment, they were ostracized by their contemporaries. Yeah. And most of those men were, they might have been abolitionists before the war, but they were social reformers, and most of them knew what they were getting into when they took on those assignments. And as the black soldiers had it really hard, the white officers had it tough.
But they got to go home.
Yeah, they got to go home. Yeah. Yes.
Have you encountered much in the way of sort of African American and white Civil War veteran comradeship in the West? So either in organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic or Memorial Day ceremonies, sort of kind of incorporating the memory of the Civil War?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I don't know if you could hear it, but after the war, veteran troops, U.S. colored troops, did they fraternize with their white counterparts in the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR? Mostly not. There were cases, especially in New England, where some black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts and others who did socialize with their white counterparts, but by and large, they didn't mix. There were some grand encampments. That's what they would call these GAR reunions, or grand encampments. And there was a big one at Gettysburg in the 1880s, and another one in 1913. The black soldiers didn't feel invited. And remember, in 1865, when they had the Grand Review in Washington, D.C., the Eastern armies, the Army of the Potomac, marched down Pennsylvania Avenue before the president. President Johnson now, because Lincoln had just been assassinated. But Grant is there, and Sherman is there, and all the VIPs are there. You didn't see very many black faces in the ranks. In fact, the Army of the Potomac, the U.S. colored troops, they were on assignment and couldn't make the big parade. The Western armies of Sherman, actually, there were thousands of black soldiers with Sherman's army who marched on the second day of the Grand Review. Most of them were carrying axes and shovels, and some of them with their rifle muskets on their shoulders, but they had been used heavily as sappers and pioneers. Those are the terms of the time, for the soldiers who go ahead and cut down the trees and dismantle the enemy abattis, the obstacles that the enemy puts before their trenches. Those pioneers and sappers, yeah.
Modern day war, they call them engineers.
They call them engineers, right. Or pioneers. They still use that term. Pioneers are the guys who go ahead of everybody else.
No, I'm talking about in
Yeah,
Vietnam.
I know.
That's what we call them when the guys went
Engineers.
off the war. Yeah, engineers.
Yeah, right. Other questions?
So this is that's a comment and a question. I mean, you're an exquisite storyteller, and these pictures are just so powerful. Are they readily available on your digital archive for someone to find these images?
Yeah, Waverly, that's a good question. I haven't found one source with all of these things. You have to hunt, but with the internet, it's a lot easier than it used to be. The Library of Congress has a tremendous collection. I would start with the Library of Congress because it's in the public domain too. You don't have to get permission to use it. There's a lot of misidentification on the internet. So if you go to Pinterest or something and you put in Buffalo Soldiers, just beware. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff made up. You're going to have to find the picture and then find out what it really is. Was there? Yeah.
I noticed, glad you put that picture up. It goes straight to my question. I noticed most of the images in your stories were around the male figures. Did you find many examples of the role of African American women in the West?
Yeah. They're certainly there. In the period that I'm dealing with, in the 1860s, there are so few women in the West other than Indian women and Hispanas. There aren't white women and there aren't black women in the West because it takes them longer to get there. The men are on the leading edge, and they're mostly military men, martial men. And that's what my book is actually about, is martial manhood. It's about this kind of military manhood run amok in the Southwest borderlands. So I do focus on the activities of men in the early years. But Goldsby's wife, Ellen Beck, was Cherokee. He met her in Oklahoma on the Cherokee Strip. And the only way that she could accompany him as a black soldier in the 10th Cavalry was as a laundress. Each company or troop would be allowed 4 laundresses, sometimes more. And those laundresses had to be married to usually a non-commissioned officer. And laundresses had a reputation because they would often equate them with prostitutes. It's not really the case, but when a soldier moved his station, the laundress wife might stay and marry another soldier. And that was true of white soldiers as well as black. So the 10th Cavalry had black laundresses with them, and they did switch husbands as troops moved. Yes?
I've been doing a lot of reading on Ulysses Grant, and read his biography, but also the Chernow, most recent. And he makes a great case, and Grant himself raised some of the most incredibly powerful analysis of why the South was better off losing the war than they would have been winning it, because of the slavery and the crushing of skilled labor in the South. And but Grant,
Spoken like a true labor historian.
and that they would eventually, the big slaveholders would dominate and swallow the small slaveholders, and the blacks would out reproduce them, and they would exterminate the slaveholders. There's a passage in Grant that I think is the most brilliant 7-sentence description of the Civil War that I've ever read. But Grant was very, very fierce about the black soldier, the anti-Klan legislation when he becomes president, the 15th Amendment, which he very much championed, demanding the 14th Amendment for people, for any states coming back into the Union had to accept the 14th Amendment. One of the things I read is that he sent several of the earliest black regiments that he armed. He also paid black laborers, the first soldier or general, to pay a wage to people who labored to defend him. But he sent 2 of the earliest black regiments west of the Mississippi, who then went into Texas and fought against the Confederacy in Texas. Do you know anything about
Well,
that?
think about this, Charlie. During Reconstruction, the South was occupied. It was occupied territory, federal troops in every state. There weren't any black troops stationed in those southern states. They thought that would be too volatile a situation. So Grant ordered them west. But he didn't think this through. He sent them to Texas. If you could imagine a place that was more virulent in its racism than Texas. And so a Texan's nightmare in 1866 was having a man in Union blue in their town, lording it over them after they had lost the war. The worst nightmare was a black man in a blue uniform lording it over them in their town. And that's why these incidents in San Angelo, Texas take place. That's why the Texas Rangers are mixing it up with Buffalo soldiers. It's a volatile situation there in the West. And Grant, I don't think, he thought he was doing the right thing by sending them west, but he really sends them out of the frying pan into the fire. Was there a question over here? Yeah, Sam.
Well, 2 things. One is, waiting for you as the question about images. For images of Buffalo soldiers, look for James Presley Ball. He was a black photographer in Cincinnati and Cheyenne, Wyoming. And when he was in Wyoming, he took a lot of pictures of Buffalo soldiers and their families. The other question I had was in regards to the Mexican-American War, and this goes back a little bit to these Afro-Mexicans. Some of those who were on the Trail of Tears from Florida to Oklahoma Territory, and then Oklahoma, they were settled in Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War. Did your research reveal anything in terms of those?
Well, the Cherokees who come with the Trail of Tears go to Indian Territory. That's what what we call Oklahoma today was then called the Indian Territory. And they really settled there along the Cherokee Strip. I'm sure some went across the border. Cherokee Bill did. It is said that Goldsby himself did. There's an article in a newspaper in 1914 that says Pancho Villa is actually George Goldsby. They were sure that this Mexican general had to be a Buffalo Soldier. He was so organized and he was so good. He had to be George Goldsby because he doesn't back down from anybody. So, I mean, there are lots of stories about both Cherokees and mixed race people. Because, as I said, Cherokee Bill was Goldsby's son with a Cherokee wife. And he had 4 brothers and sisters as well. So the intermarriage, the intermixing, it's not a black and white story. It's a story of all those shades. Matter of fact, if I went back to that slide at the beginning that showed all those people all over the world of all those different colors, that's who we really are, is a mixture of all those cultures, all those peoples. Well, I think we probably better wrap things up for tonight. I want to thank you again for your